Hello, comrades. Welcome to this video series on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video, we'll be focusing on our first topic, which really provides a context for the Russian Revolution, and particularly the context for Area of Study 1, which begins at the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II and ends at the October Revolution of 1917. So in this video, we'll be learning about Imperial Russia. First of all, let's have a look at Russia's land and people. The Russian Empire was enormous. All you need to do is look at a map of the world and see just how massive Russia is. At the height of the Russian Empire, it spanned 8,000 kilometers east to west, 3,000 kilometers north to south, and covered 11 different time zones. Now, as you can imagine, this made communication and defense difficult. This is a time when, Russia didn't have the best train network. They did eventually create the Trans-Siberian Railway, but with such an enormous land to govern, communication and defense was very difficult at this time. A journey across the empire could take weeks or in winter, even months to complete. Russia's population as well increased rapidly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1815, the population was estimated at 40 million people, and this tripled in only about 80 years. By 1897, the time of Russia's first census, the population was 126 million people. So it had a rapidly growing population. Most of these, as we'll see in a minute, were concentrated in Europe, as opposed to the Asian part of the Russian Empire. So rapidly growing population, enormous land. It made governing very, very hard, as you can imagine. Russia also had a diverse ethnic population with 60 different nationalities recognized. There was a diverse array of languages, religious beliefs, customs, and cultures in Russian society. Now, despite this, from the 1890s, the government carried out a deliberate policy of Russification. That being the forcing of the Russian language and customs upon ethnic minorities. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't go down all that well on these ethnic minorities, particularly when there were so many of them, so many different nationalities, so many different ethnic minorities. So that tells you a little bit about Russia's land and people. As you can see from this map, most of the Russian population was concentrated around Europe. If we look across to Asia, there are very few people out there. It's really sparsely populated. Only one person, according to this, per square kilometer in these areas. While over here, we've got much more densely populated cities and towns, and even the rural parts of European Russia were much more densely populated. We were close to towns at all times. Some of the significant cities and towns, we've got Moscow. We've got, on this map, it says Leningrad. That was the name given to St. Petersburg, or at another time named as Petrograd. Leningrad was the name given after the revolution. So at this point in time, this period that we're looking at, this was Petrograd. We've got Kiev over here, and many other smaller cities and towns. So that gives you a bit of a visual representation of the Russian Empire at this time. Social classes. The Russian people were generally categorized into 5 social classes. According to the 1897 census, 0.5% of the population were the ruling class. That included the Tsar and his court and government. 12% of the population were the upper class. So that means the nobility, the higher clergy, the military officers. 1.5% were commercial class, including merchants, factory owners, and financiers. Now, if we are talking about this from Marxist perspective, the upper class and commercial class, they are what we would refer to as the bourgeoisie. That's Bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie were basically the factory owners, the nobility, the rich people in Russian society, while the proletariat were 4% of the population. They were the working class, the factory workers and the small traders. Now, proletariat and working class are not to be confused with peasants. Peasants made up an entirely different social class. They made up 82% of Russia's population. They were the farmers, the agricultural workers. Now, this is quite significant, this split of the percentage of the different social classes, because according to Marxist theory, there needs to be a capitalist system in place for there to be a socialist and then a communist revolution and uprising. And a capitalist system, the reason that that's important is because under a capitalist system, there is bound to be, according to Marx, a high percentage of the population are workers, working class, people working in factories. Peasants, according to Marx, were not a suitable social class for a revolution, a communist revolution. So capitalism was a necessary step for a communist revolution. And as you can see with this graph, only 4% of the population were what we would consider the proletariat, with over 12% of the population as the bourgeoisie. That's not very good numbers for a communist revolution. And the 82% of peasants, there were many in Russia who wanted a peasant uprising, but according to a Marxist interpretation, they were not a suitable group for the revolution. So anyway, that gives a brief overview of the social classes of Russia at the end of the 19th century. Excuse me. The Tsarist regime. So the Russian Empire was an autocracy, which meant that all political authority was held by the reigning monarch, called the Tsar. Now, the Tsar was said to have ruled by divine right. That means that he was ordained to rule by God. Now, as you can imagine, if you have grown up in the monarchy, you are a small child being told endlessly that you will rule one day and it is God's will that you are going to rule, that would be quite powerful for you. If you were an up-and-coming Tsar, then you would feel like it is your duty and your right by God to rule. As such, many Russians referred to the Tsar as their little father. And Tsars were expected to be a number of things. They were expected to be strong and fearsome and mighty, but they were also expected, as a father would, to be gentle and caring and nurturing. They were the father of the Russian people. And so they needed to be strong, but they also needed to be gentle and caring. The Tsar was advised, now he didn't just rule completely everything by himself. That would be impossible, especially with the sheer size of Russia and the amount of people in Russia. So he was advised by the state council, and these were all members appointed by the Tsar. He also had ministers who were in charge of departments such as commerce, education, finance, the military. So he could delegate tasks to them. One major weakness of this Tsarist regime was that the direction of its policies and the confidence of its authority depended entirely on the individual character of the Tsar. What this means is that um, if you've got a Tsar who has been brought up being taught how to lead, how to be a strong leader, what the role of the Tsar is, and they are able to learn that over the course of their early life, so that when they do assume the role of Tsar, they are completely ready and know exactly what to do. It's likely that you're going to have a pretty successful reign. If you have a Tsar who is not prepared and assumes the role perhaps a bit too early, then they're not going to have so much success. This will be significant, as you will see quite shortly. Now, the Tsarist regime maintained a massive military force. It had the largest permanent army in Europe and also had a large and formidable navy. Now, the army was used to defend the empire, as well as to enforce domestic security. So that means that in times of unrest, the Tsar might unleash his troops against his own people. Now, that was only to be used to really quell rebellious action. Because remember, the Tsar needed to be strong, but also caring. So he couldn't stand for unrest, but when there was no rebellion, no unrest, no revolutionary action, then he was expected to be a caring leader. The Tsarist regime had two distinct police forces. There was the regular police, which dealt with law and order, and the oulines, which dealt with agitators and political crimes, trying to maintain order and quell any rebellious action. Now, since 1613, every Tsar had come from the Romanov family. Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia, he was Nicholas Romanov, son of Alexander III. Now, Alexander III was a very autocratic leader. He did not believe in any reforms and believed that he was ordained to rule by God, and he would do it as a firmly autocratic leader. His father, Alexander II, was much more open to reform. This is at a time when the rest of Europe was moving down quite a liberal path, in that many monarchies were becoming constitutional monarchies, where they had constitutions, they had parliaments. Think of the United Kingdom and their monarchy, the way that runs, with a dual monarchy and parliament. So Alexander II was quite open to these reforms. Alexander III and then Nicholas, as we'll see shortly, they were not. They were completely autocratic and believed they were due to rule. Now, in the 1890s, there was a famine crisis. In 1891, a large portion of Russia was hit by famine, which was followed by an outbreak of cholera and typhus that killed up to 400,000 people by the end of 1892. This created tension between the government and the people because the regime's response to the famine was slow and ineffective. So thinking about this in terms of the context of Area of Study 1, starting with Nicholas's coronation, even before Nicholas took the throne, people were already discontent with the Tsarist regime because they didn't protect them at this time. They didn't respond quickly enough to the famine. Now, the intelligentsia in particular grew disillusioned with the Tsarist regime crisis. By intelligentsia, we mean the academic, the learned, who often at this time were quite left-wing, quite revolutionary. One member of the intelligentsia, Vladimir Lenin, who later became the leader of Russia's most radical Marxist group, the Bolsheviks, and whose name we will hear many times this term. He claimed that the famine was a good thing, as it heightened tension between the government and its people, making it more likely for a communist uprising and revolution. Leon Trotsky, another very significant individual, many times in the future, and another revolutionary, pointed out that peasants were snatched from the plow and hurled straight into the factory furnace. Due to the famine, so many people moved from the farms to the cities. This increased the amount of workers in Russian cities, which, as you'll remember from earlier in the video, that was important for communist uprising, as the more workers, the stronger the country was for, and the stronger the country was for a communist uprising, with a higher proportion of the proletariat. Now, Tsar Nicholas II, as I alluded to earlier, Tsar Nicholas II wasn't all that ready to become Tsar. His father, Alexander III, died in October 1894, not 1984, 1894 of kidney failure when he was just 49 years old. This meant that his son, Nicholas II, assumed the throne in 1894, much earlier than he would have expected. He would have expected his father to live for at least 20, maybe 30 more years for him to learn how to rule and how to be an effective Tsar. In Nicholas's own words, he said, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." This doesn't look very good for Nicholas. Doesn't bode well for his rule. Nicholas, only a week after the funeral of his father, married Princess Alexandra of Germany. Now, the fact that Tsarina Alexandra was of German heritage would later have significant consequences, particularly around World War I, when Russia was at war with Germany. Many hoped that Nicholas would bring about reforms in the way Russia was governed. As I mentioned, this was happening throughout Europe. But he committed to upholding, in his own words, the principle of autocracy as firmly and undeviatingly as did my late father. Now, this brings us to the beginning of our first area of study, which was the official coronation of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, held on 14th of May, 1896. The coronation celebrations included a huge open-air banquet to common people held at the Kaninka field on the outskirts of Moscow. Those attending were promised food and gifts, and tens of thousands of people came to the celebration. However, rumors of shortages of food and gifts, as well as organizational errors, created a mass panic, and there was an enormous stampede, and the police failed to keep order, meaning that thousands of people rushed forward to where they thought the gifts were being distributed. As a result of this, over 1,300 people were killed and thousands more were injured. Now, the coronation went ahead, and Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra heard about this tragedy right before they were due to go to a celebratory ball hosted by the French embassy. Now, the Tsar thought, "This is terrible. What a tragedy. I don't know if I should go to this ball." But his advisors said that it would be poor form to not attend his own celebratory ball. And so, being the weak leader that he was, he decided to go to the celebratory ball hosted by the French embassy. Now, as you can imagine, this made him seem like he didn't particularly care about his people. He was meant to be their little father, and yet he did not go to their aid and did not check that they were all right. And so this perceived lack of care led to Nicholas being dubbed by many Nicholas the Bloody. That is where we start area of study 1, causes of the Russian Revolution. With Nicholas assuming the throne too early, when he was not prepared. Even he admitted that he wasn't prepared and didn't even want to rule. And on his very first day of ruling after the coronation, he was dubbed Nicholas the Bloody. That's not a very good way to start your reign. So that's where we start area of study 1. You can use this video and this video series anytime you want for a revision. I look forward to the term ahead, and I will see you all soon. Thanks.